Okay, so it's Christine Scudder coming at you again to connect with you about the topic of special education. I want to let you know that this is a very content-heavy module, and so it's one that you may want to come back to more than once. And there is a robust resource section for this piece, this part of the course. So if you haven't already, please take a look at it. In particular, I want to draw your attention to a document that I put together called Deciphering Some of the Alphabet Soup, focusing on public education. Social work and schools and education settings both use quite a few acronyms. I think schools may have exceeded what we do even in social work. So you may find this tool helpful to look at and refer back to, both as we go through content here and also possibly for a quiz. I also want to point your attention to the actual text of the law for IDEA from the U.S. Department of Education website. You can actually look at the law itself. You can also look at fact sheets relating to equity in IDEA, which is something we'll talk about. There's a graphic that looks at the least restrictive environment that you may find useful to explore, as well as some content relating to positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS. All of these things we will be talking about further in this lecture, but again, just want to point you to that resource tab. Okay, so let's dig into it. I want to start by talking about the purpose for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This is a federal law that initially was put into law in 1975 as the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. Subsequently, over the last 40 plus years, this legislation has had different names with continued changes and enhancements. In 1990 was when the law first became known as IDEA. One of its most substantive and recent changes was in 2004 when there was a key area looking at the importance of improved outcomes and more accountability around the outcomes for children who are in special education. And also an important acknowledgement of racial disproportionality in special education programs. In fact, school districts who are found to have a disproportionate number of minority students, using that language in the law, minority students, who are placed in special education for reasons other than that of a disability, would have to redirect up to 15% of their special education funds into the general education fund. And we'll talk about the 13 categories for qualifying a student for special education. What this particular section refers to in general is that of emotional disturbance, which is not a well-defined category and is viewed as a category to allow a student to receive special education services, but is not necessarily a disability in itself. So this becomes complex, and that is what this amendment that I mentioned refers to. We'll get more into that in a little bit. But in general, I want to talk about the purpose of IDEA, which again was enacted to assist states in meeting the educational needs of students with disabilities, and is noted looking at the appropriate education for students with disabilities to really maximize that provision. And one of the changes to this law over time, actually in the 1980s under President Reagan, was really looking at increased levels of parental input in decision making throughout the process. So you'll note as we go into it and as you look at some of the provided materials that there are a number of checks and balances relating to parental input and requests for testing, etc., and there's also opportunities to appeal decisions. And when we say parent here, we also really want to be clear that what we're referring to, while it's often a parent, is not always a parent. It is the person who is holding educational rights, which is something we'll come back to in a little bit. So protections under IDEA. Who's protected? Students between the ages of 3 and 21 with disabilities that adversely affect their education. So again, this includes young ones who are younger than pre-K and post-high school grade up to age 21. As noted earlier, there are 13 specific categories of eligibility for protection under IDEA, which we'll talk about. There is what's called absolute coverage for students ages 6 through 17. This is typically viewed as compulsory years of compulsory education. And there are early intervention services for little ones birth through age 2. So as we look at the major principles of IDEA, there are 4 parts to the law itself, parts A through D, which I'll briefly go over. Part A in the law articulates a justification for IDEA and defines key terminology. Part B looks at the educational requirements for students ages 3 to 21. I'll be focusing largely on Part B in this lecture. Part C articulates early intervention services for children birth through 2. And Part D looks at research, personnel preparation, and professional development needs for teachers and other professionals providing services, supports, and education to students under IDEA. So getting to that Part B, there are some key concepts. Again, some of this is in the alphabet soup, what I call the alphabet soup handout in the resource section. The first area I want to talk about is zero reject and notions of FAPE, child find for children birth to 21. So zero reject really calls to mind the idea that no child is viewed as being, quote, uneducatable, right? All children have a right to an education, and so we are not looking to reject any children or potential students because of a disability. So that's the notion of zero reject. FAPE is a word, or rather an acronym, that you'll see throughout special education legislation, and it stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education, FAPE. And so what that means is it's an educational program individualized to a specific child, designed to meet that child's unique needs, providing access to the general curriculum, and meeting grade level expectations. So that's what FAPE really means. Child find is this notion that school districts have a responsibility to conduct outreach and look for children who may qualify for special education services. So not merely to kind of wait for someone to self-refer, but also to look at prevention and early intervention, again for kiddos birth through 21. So again, around that, identification and evaluation can come through multiple sources. There's a 60-day time frame for eligibility decisions under IDEA, and that time frame is broken down much more specifically, as we'll get into later, from the initial notation of the need for testing, for example, all the way through to making an eligibility decision. The LRE is the least restrictive environment. That is a term that is also used throughout special education legislation. And it's the requirement under federal law that students with disabilities receive their education to the maximum extent appropriate with non-disabled peers, and that special education students are not removed from regular classes unless, even with supplemental aids and services, education in regular classes cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Okay, so least restrictive environment, as the name suggests, we want to minimize disruptions to the traditional educational opportunities in the classroom, minimize pullout, try to use supplemental aids and services to keep children in regular education classrooms as much as possible. There are also important procedural safeguards. The handout that's referenced here refers to the resource section on B courses that looks at procedures for special education. Technology-related assistance, this is an important area in terms of thinking about supplemental aids and services that may be available for students to be able to maximize their opportunities in the LRE. So this could be having devices like pens that have an audio recording feature while the student is writing. It's also audio recording what the teacher might be saying, for example. That might be an example of technology-related assistance. Using other types of apps and programs to be able to communicate verbally, to point to something that and push a button that would then state something out loud might be another option. So those are just some brief examples. Parental participation is also well defined in Part B under IDEA. So when we talk about students with disabilities, want to be really clear what we're talking about, because we are going to talk about the difference between 504 plans and individualized education plans. So what's important here is that special education is for students who have a disability and a need for specialized instruction. There are some students who have disabilities who do not have a need for specialized instruction. For example, a student may have a disability that places them in a wheelchair. That does not mean that they have a need for specialized instruction because of that. They may have a need for accommodation, which we'll talk about under 504, but they do not need specialized instruction, meaning the educational instruction that's being delivered by the teacher for the traditional education classroom does not need to be delivered any differently with any other assistance or any other additional services in order for that student to benefit from that instruction. Okay, so those two things need to be in place. Student has a disability and a need for specialized instruction. So as defined under Public Law 94-142, which is another way of defining or talking about IDEA, again, that's a free and appropriate education, a right to an IEP or an individualized education plan, a right to special education services, a right to related services. Related services might include such things as occupational therapy, OT, physical therapy, PT, counseling services, etc. Special education, as defined, also includes a right to due process procedures. And as noted, students have a right to placement in the least restrictive environment. Okay, so these are some really key elements that are present for students with disabilities in need of special education under IDEA. As noted, this is different from students who may have disabilities or have needs for accommodations under a 504 plan. Okay, special education is separate from that. So an IEP, or an individualized education plan, the eligibility under IDEA for that IEP, individuals with disabilities, if a student has one of 13 eligible disabilities, and that disability created a need for special education and related services in order for the student to benefit from their education. Okay, so the related or specialized services are needed for the student to be able to benefit from their education if they have a disability. So the eligible disabilities include autism, hearing impairment, including deafness, deafblindness, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment or OHI, Serious emotional disturbance, I noted that earlier. Specific learning disability, speech and language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment, including blindness. Okay, so two of the areas that we often kind of hear about as social workers, and we often hear, of course, about all of these, but ones where we might be called to kind of comment might fall under the area of other health impairment and also serious emotional disturbance. As we'll talk about, other health impairment is defined in the law. Serious emotional disturbance, however, is not. And this can lead to, as noted earlier, disproportionate referrals to students in special education. And we'll talk about the ways in which that has been a very racialized practice over time and has had very negative outcomes for our students. So as noted, other health impairment is defined in the law as means having limited strength, vitality, or alertness, including a heightened alertness to environmental stimuli that results in limited alertness with respect to the educational environment that is due to a chronic or health problem such as asthma, attention deficit disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, diabetes, epilepsy, heart condition, hemophilia, lead poisoning, leukemia, nephritis, rheumatic fever, sickle cell anemia, and Tourette syndrome, and adversely affects a child's educational performance. Okay, so OHI, when people ask about, can ADHD count, quote unquote, as a disability for special education? Yes, it can. More often you will see it under a 504 plan, which we'll talk about, but it is here in black and white in the way that the law is defined. As is Tourette syndrome. In particular, these are, disorders that we might be diagnosing if we are a licensed clinical social worker, or as a social worker in a school where we may or may not have our license. These may be diagnoses that we are aware of through reviewing records and CUME files. So we'll get into this a little bit further in a little bit. So funding for IDEA, in order to receive federal funds, states have to submit a plan demonstrating the provision of FAPE to all qualified students between the ages of 3 and 21. So these federal funds are not given automatically. Again, these plans must be submitted to the federal government. And it's important to understand, I mentioned this in the first lecture, around federal funding for education in general, and talking about special education in particular, as some refer to it as really an unfunded or a poorly funded mandate. Again, IDEA is a federal mandate. However, as noted here, federal funds are not intended to cover the entire cost of special education services for states. The federal funding for IDEA covers close to 19% of a state's cost. And so again, that leaves the bulk of it, up to 80% at the state and local level for funding. The amount of federal funds that are given to states is based on the number of students with disabilities that are served by that school, though not to exceed 12%. And so that's important to understand because we may see larger numbers of children with disabilities in certain school districts than others. And so that's important to understand that there is that cap coming from the federal funding source. So when we think about monitoring and enforcement for IDEA, there's the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP. This office drafts regulations for implementing IDEA. They conduct activities for training and professional development under Part D of IDEA, monitor and enforce the law, and provide technical assistance to states. The U.S. Department of Education ensures, with an asterisk, I'll come back to that, that states comply with IDEA provisions and that states ensure that local school districts comply with IDEA. The reason for the asterisk is there have been a number of recent claims and lawsuits looking at Betsy DeVos's role through the Department of Education in failing to ensure that states comply with IDEA provisions. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is not business as usual. This is a very different time where the Department of Education has definitely been called into question by teachers and educators throughout the country as to whether or not they are truly focused on the needs of children and students. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that's played out, but for now I just wanted to flag it as something we need to come back to, and that we need to continue to monitor and to frankly to question in the current climate. So I've mentioned a few times that special education is different from 504, so I want to talk about what is 504 and what does that refer to. So when we talk about 504 plans, that's typically how you'll hear it referred to in schools. This, in its more longer name, refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. For students to be eligible for a 504 plan, they must have a record of, or be regarded as having, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So it's important to understand here must have record of, or be regarded as having. So it's important to understand that this doesn't need to be proven through testing, for example, or have an official diagnosis. If a teacher or if other students kind of have the sense that a child has physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of their major life activities, they may be eligible for a 504 plan. 504 plans offer reasonable accommodations to the existing curriculum. Okay, so this language is really important as we differentiate it from special education. 504 plan has reasonable accommodations to the existing curriculum. So in the example that I gave earlier for a student who may have some physical limitations in terms of a physical disability, such that they may require a wheelchair while they're in school, the reasonable accommodation is ensuring that their seat, for example, where they place themselves in the classroom, has an accessible table that will conform to the physical needs of that student in their wheelchair, for example. That would be considered a reasonable accommodation to the existing curriculum. It doesn't change how the content of the course is delivered. There are no other specialized devices provided by the school. The accommodation would be the table being in such a manner and in such a placement in the classroom so as to offer reasonable accommodation to that student. Okay, there's lots of different examples of reasonable accommodations. This is just one. Another may be for students who have a difficult time with focus and attention, like we might see, for example, with a student who may have ADHD. A reasonable accommodation for a student with these challenges might be that they would have more time to take a test or be offered a distraction-free environment. Classrooms can be filled with distractions, both in terms of things that are posted on the walls, announcements that come through over the loudspeaker, sitting at a desk with 2 or 3 other students at their little table. These are all opportunities that are ripe with distraction, right? So a reasonable accommodation in that situation might be something like reduced distractions or more time. For a 504 plan, the school district needs consent, but it doesn't require a parent or guardian signature. So it could be a verbal consent, and it's important to understand that parents aren't always informed when a 504 plan is coming together in the first place. So we'll talk about that too. So 504 plans again, this refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it's important to understand this is a federal civil rights anti-discrimination law that applies to eligible adults and children. Okay, so this is about civil rights and reasonable accommodation. It is not a part of IDEA or special education. It is considered a responsibility of general education program. There is no state or federal funding for 504. IDEA spells out the meaning of FAPE for IDEA eligible students, but for 504 students, this is far less clear. Again, it's a civil rights anti-discrimination law that generally speaks about reasonable accommodations, but it really doesn't define what is, a free and appropriate public education. It also doesn't define what accommodations are, what is reasonable, and so there are ways in which 504 is much more general. To be eligible for 504, an individual with a disability. So again, any person with a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities, including but not limited to walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, working, performing manual tasks, caring for oneself, reading, thinking, or concentrating. The person, again, has a record of such an impairment or is regarded as having such an impairment. So again, when you look at these terms and definitions of disability, you can see that this is a pretty broad range of examples that also do align with the 13 categories of disability under IDEA, but again, remember that these are different. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of kind of eliminating the silos between regular education, quote-unquote regular education and special education. I think it's important to know that for a very long time these two have run largely in parallel but very separate from one another. And there are some key changes that have been coming in the last 5 to 10 years that particularly impact us as social workers as well, that really address this issue. So there's a lot going on in this slide. I wanted to fit it all in one place. So I think I broke all the rules of PowerPoint. So there it is. I've come out to you about that. All right. So this slide addresses the notion of response to intervention, or RTI. You can see these color-coded tiers, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. I'm going to unpack these a little bit more carefully in the subsequent slides. But the idea with the tiered interventions is really understanding that there are levels of need both at the academic level and also at the behavioral, emotional level. And this is a place where we work hand in hand with teachers and social workers in schools to understand these core supports. So at Tier 1, right, and that's kind of the largest group of students in a school. So these colors represent green is go towards a large number of students. Yellow is kind of slowing it down. It's kind of a moderate group of students, and Tier 3 is intensive levels of services, okay? So when we think about special education, for example, that's a Tier 3 level interventions, okay? Tier 1 might be open to 80 to 90% of students in the school. This is much more about school climate, looking at universal screening, delivered evidence-based instruction to all students, right? So really focusing on school-wide individual and school-wide crisis response, those kinds of things, right? That's kind of open to all. Tier 2 supplemental levels of support are offered in small groups, provided for short periods of time, discrete periods, 3 to 5 days per week for 8 to 10 weeks to see whether the student's determined to be at risk for school failure. And these services are offered in addition to Tier 1 services. But again, it's for a smaller group of students, really looking at best practices to try and target interventions to see if we can kind of help students to redress the issues that are challenging for them. And we assess that through monitoring weekly or biweekly to look at the student's response to the intervention provided. Level 3, or Tier 3 rather, excuse me, in intensive level services really are those individualized services. These would be for special education services provided one-on-one or in small groups, generally speaking 5 days a week for 45 to 90 minutes a day. We're monitoring that at least weekly to look at the response to intervention provided. Diagnostic assessments about specific students and needs to adjusting to this intervention are a part of that intensive level of service. Okay, so Tier 3 is, for a small group of students, provided one-to-one or in small groups with that individualized, i.e. like IEP, right? Individualized education plan would be considered an intensive Tier 3 service. So one of the things that we'll be hearing and seeing quite a bit in schools is really kind of looking at, okay, have we tried Tier 2 services before we've referred students to special education? This is one to make sure that we're not over-referring kids to special education. We want to be mindful about disproportionate referrals that can occur, racial disproportionality that is rampant in the special education system across the country. That's one part of it. Another part of it, frankly, is cost savings for schools because, as mentioned, the special education services are costly and they are not very well funded from the federal government. And so, it is incumbent upon state and local governments to cover those costs. State and local, funds and district level services to pay for those services. So, thinking about PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports. These are the things that are put in place at the various tiers. So again, just to kind of break it down, at Tier 1, maybe the focus is more kind of consulting, right? We might consult as social workers. We might consult with teachers about, how do we promote trauma-informed, positive classroom climate, those kinds of things. We might consult with teachers, consult with the district, consult with the school leadership. These are universal interventions for about 80 to 90% of students. They're proactive, they're preventative. Again, Tier 2, we're looking at 5 to 15% of the students in the school, with looking at those specifically who may be at risk of failing, at risk of significant truancy-related concerns, at risk of failing a particular class. Some individualization happens at this level, more small group interventions at a rapid response with high levels of efficiency. So again, here we're coordinating, right? We're more hands-on. Sorry about that. We're more hands-on with teachers and also with family members. We might provide a social worker small group counseling, individual or short-term goal-oriented supports in schools at this level. Then Tier 3 is really that 1 to 5% right at the top of the pyramid, right? And these are individual student interventions that are assessment-based with high levels of intensity. Again, that might be like school-focused case management for individual students and families. We might do that as social workers. Again, we might be involved with individual and school-wide crisis response at this level. And we talked earlier about what that would look like in terms of the educational focus, right? But this is the kind of the focus that we might have as social workers, not as teachers. Tier 3 is a lot about facilitating, right? It's facilitating those services right on site. So, one of the things before I move on to the IEP process really quick around PBIS is it's really, I really want to invite you to take a look at the posted website that looks at how PBIS has been integrated into the law around IDEA. Again, we really want to think about how are we being accountable to schools and to students within the schools and to the communities and families by making sure that the interventions that we are putting into place are really well focused on the students' needs and that we are trying what we can to be effective, efficient, and respectful of student needs before automatically referring them to special education. I think on the other side of that, we also want to be mindful of sometimes schools can kind of push back on our desire to obtain testing for students because they may kind of keep pushing back on saying, hey, wait a minute, what about that Tier 2 intervention? Before we go to Tier 3, have you done enough at Tier 2? And sometimes we need to keep pushing that, and that can be challenging in our work with the schools. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So in terms of the IEP process itself, there is a sample letter on B courses. But the parent or person holding educational rights needs to write a letter. It needs to be in writing to the school special education department to request an assessment or evaluation in all areas of suspected disability. Okay, and as social workers, it's not uncommon for us to point parents in the direction of standard language for this letter. The disability rights and education folks at DREAD have a lot of powerful resources on their website, which is also on our B Courses page, and I encourage you to poke around there and get familiar with what all they have to offer. It's really extensive, really powerful information, again, including that sample letter. They also have meetings in the community. They're local. We're lucky here in the Bay because they're local, and have meetings that parents can go to learn more information about how to request these services and how to go through the process. So once that request has been made, there is an additional 15 days to consent to the plan by signing and returning the plan to the school. And within 60 days total, consent to complete the assessment and hold the IEP meeting. At the IEP meeting itself, there should be the regular education teacher, special education teachers, administrator, district decision maker, and any related service providers. That can include us as social workers if we're at the school, the parent, and when appropriate, the student. If the student is deemed eligible, the next step will be to develop goals and objectives, evaluate the needs of any technology assistance, and what kind of services are offered and by whom. An appropriate placement in terms of where a student is receiving their education is one where a child has, quote, a reasonable chance of meeting their IEP goals. And again, that placement needs to be made with the notion of the least restrictive environment in mind. Some examples of high levels of restriction, the highest level would be some type of an institutional facility, like being a juvenile hall, for example, and kind of going down from that. If you're looking at the least restrictive environment graphic that I mentioned on the resource page of B Courses, the next one down from that is residential placement, then home hospital, non-public schools, state schools, county classes or programs, down through special day class, right? So kind of going down that line. And what we really need to do with that IEP is to make sure that we place the student in the least restrictive environment where they have a reasonable chance of meeting their IEP goals. I encourage you to see B Courses for more detailed information about parents' rights to due process hearings if they disagree at any step in the process, and some more nuanced information about how much time the school has to respond at each step. These are kind of general steps at a larger level. So the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance is just terminology I want you to be aware of. The PLAP, or sometimes people call it the PLOP, unfortunate acronym. But it's important in preparing, looking at these IEP goals, that we need to establish a baseline before setting a goal. And while that's often not your role as a social worker, you may be asked for input in creating these goals and objectives. So it's important that that baseline be addressed. That's not unlike what we talk about in the mental health settings, right? Where to prepare a treatment plan, we need to say, that student will increase a desired behavior from current baseline of, 2 out of 5 times to an increased level of, 4 out of 5 times, right? So we need to be clear what the baseline is. Our failure to do so can be used as evidence as a part of a district denial of a free and appropriate education. So that's important for us to be aware of. An important area I want to touch on, we're going to be getting into areas of discipline next week, or one of our later modules. But when we talk about this notion of manifest determination, this is an important term in special education services. So students in special education cannot be suspended for more than 10 consecutive days. If their suspension is longer than that, or if it operates in a series of suspensions, or constitutes a pattern of suspension, it could be considered an improper change in placement for that student. So the manifest determination question is this: is the behavior that resulted in the suspension, is the behavior the result of the student's disability? If so, the school district cannot change the student's placement because of it. In other words, if this behavior is something we might expect due to the student's disability, we cannot change their placement because of that. We should basically expect it, right? We should expect it, plan for it, and create appropriate goals and or place appropriate supports in place to redress those concerns. If a student with a disability is expelled, if their behavior results in an expulsion, this does represent a change in educational placement and requires a new IEP immediately. Okay, so that's important to note, manifest determination. Okay, so I know that was a lot of kind of dense material for this segment. I want to end by sharing a relatively recent legal case that came about nearby here in Contra Costa County, where there's a class action lawsuit filed by a group of parents and students against Contra Costa County Juvenile Hall facilities. So when we talk about least restrictive environment, that is the most restrictive environment, right, as an institution. And young people who were placed in solitary confinement, this was viewed as a violation of manifest determination. Juvenile hall facilities weren't always calling solitary confinement. They would call it being on program, or they call it a variety of different things. But whatever it was called, in practice it involved students being alone. It meant that they were not in their classroom, right? Because when they're in juvenile hall, students still have a right to an education, and that happens in juvenile hall. In solitary, the students were not getting their educational needs met, and students with a disability, again, if that behavior was a manifestation of their disability, which, that's what this class action lawsuit alleged, it was a violation of manifest determination. So this was a pretty important case because through partial settlement, it actually eliminated the process of solitary confinement in juvenile facilities in Contra Costa County, which helped all young people. I think many people would agree that solitary confinement is an inhumane practice for children, also for adults. And so this lawsuit actually got federal attention in terms of violation of students' rights under IDEA. So if you're interested, some of the parents who were involved in the suit have been agreed to participate in some video recordings, and they shared some of their stories, and I posted those on B-Courses if you're interested in listening more to their experience. Okay, so thank you so much for your attention. I know this was a lot of content. Again, please take some time to avail yourself of the resources that are posted, and there is a quiz opportunity that is required, a required opportunity, so maybe it doesn't feel like an opportunity. That's a part of this module, and I invite you to continue to review these materials as we go forward. So I look forward to connecting with you in our next installment, and thank you so much for your attention.